Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Dog Walk, the almost daily, one take, uncut, unedited, because I think that's more authentic, show where I take my two dogs, Mista and Daisy, out for their walk and discuss whatever's been on my mind for that day. Today, I want to talk about a little bit of a philosophical topic but I want to introduce it through, and the reason why I want to talk about it and the way I will introduce it is by discussing girls, come on, that's probably not something you want to smell, is by discussing an anime that I just finished watching a few minutes ago, actually, which is why this is what's on my mind right now. I don't think I've ever mentioned it really as part of my interests, but I keep saying how I don't like to limit myself and I'm trying to be versatile in my interests. Well, I am a huge anime nerd. I'll let you judge that. According to my MAL list, my anime list, where I keep track of what I watch, because otherwise I wouldn't remember everything, it says that I've watched just shy of 117 days of anime. Now that's 117 times 24 hours of episodes, at episodes that are 20 minutes mostly each. So you do the math, right? That's 3 episodes per hour, so that's 72 hours per day. Sorry, 72 episodes per day, and I've watched 117. So I've watched my fair share of anime. So something you might probably didn't know about me. But the anime in question that I just finished watching is called Vinland Saga. And it's an extremely highly rated. Season 2, I think it is rated 8.81 out of 10 on my anime list, which, if you know the site, you'll know how high that is. It's among the top rankings of all time of all anime shows. And I sort of disagree with that ranking. I gave it a 7, which is good, but it's not earth-shattering like everyone seems to think it is. And that's one reason, and sorry for this aside, one reason why I don't always trust my anime list scores, because there's a lot of people who are quite young and who think that they are deep and who will see a lot more than there actually is, or will find a concept that is well understood and has been well explored many times earth-shattering to them because it's the first time that they hear about it. And conversely, the other side also happens, or things that are rated much lower than, in my opinion, should be, because people probably didn't get it and they were just expecting fighting or something like that, and they miss out on the point of the anime. Anyway, sorry, that was a little aside rant on my anime list website, but I want to talk about Vinland Saga because the principle, and I will spoil mild spoilers for the series. I highly recommend you watch it. It's available on Netflix in English, so you don't even need to watch it in Japanese or with subtitles or anything like that. So highly recommend you watch it. But spoiler warning done, I will just summarize a little bit of the show. In a nutshell, it's a story of a Viking from Iceland who, when he's 6 years old, goes with his father, who gets ambushed and killed, and he becomes trained, and you imagine the anime protagonist, he's running around with his 2 daggers, and he's able to kill and destroy all the biggest, strongest, baddest fighters that there are in the Viking world just by himself. He wounds King Cnut, the king of the Vikings, etc. So he's pardon my language, my French, he's a total badass. But what happens is in season 2, he gets sold into slavery for reasons that I can't get into because I don't want to just talk about summarize the anime. He gets sold into slavery, and he sort of matures, quote unquote, and he adopts a philosophy of peacefulness and non-violence. And that's what I think most people think is like super deep and blah 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 about this show. And that's where I sort of disagree and think actually that it's very naive. And that's the philosophical point that I want to bring or to discuss. It's the concept of peacefulness, and is it possible in the real world? And opposite to that, I guess, a concept of might makes right. I'm sure you've heard that expression before. If you haven't, it basically means that whoever is the strongest typically will be right because they get to impose their will on others because they're the strongest, and there's just nothing that others can do against them. So they are right, and the weaker people are wrong because they can't impose their will on others. You'll notice that this very much aligns with, I've discussed in other episodes, the ancient Roman and Greek philosophy. They prized, valued strength and honor way above compassion and things like that, like we do in the modern Christian world. Sorry, the girls are lagging behind today because, again, weather, which I understand is not climate, but global warming, it's plus 2 degrees right now, so there's lots of smells from the ground thawing. So my apologies if it's a little bit slower of a walk and the girls keep lagging behind me right now. But yeah, what really triggered me to want to discuss this specific topic in the show is, I want to say it's in the last 3 or 4 episodes of the show where of the season, where he has the hero Thorfinn has up until then managed to continue to avoid fighting, and because that's his goal as the newly discovered peace and love non-violent person, right? And the Vikings invade the farm, and hundreds of peasants are killed, and he decides to go because he feels that he owes his slave master for their kindness and the way they treated him over the last 4 years. He feels like he owes it to them to go try and prevent the Vikings and stop from taking control of the farm, slaughtering everyone, invading, all of that good stuff, right? And he thinks he can do that because I told you he was a total badass, right? He was actually part of like the king or the emperor's guard. He is the super skilled fighter, right? But he thinks that he has this link with the king, he can just go and convince him to be peaceful. And don't get me wrong, he succeeds because it's an anime, it's a show. But in reality, I think that the way that he goes about it shows that he himself doesn't actually understand or apply his philosophy. Because in order to gain an audience with the king, with King Cnut, what he does is he goes up to all the King's Guard by himself, unarmed, and he decides to just take a beating from their biggest warrior up until they decide to let him through. All the Vikings are taking bets because he's a scrawny, tiny little thing compared to the big warrior, and he refuses to fight back. So all the Vikings start to take bets on how many punches he can take before he passes out or is killed, right? And to make a long story short, he says, "Oh, I can endure 100 of your punches from you, giant of a man." While all the Vikings think, most of the Vikings thinks he can't even take 10. And he's like, "No, I will take 100 of your punches, and I don't want any of your money that you guys are all betting on. If I win, all I want is an audience with the king." So that piques the interest of the Vikings, who are, big warriors, and they agree. And again, because it's an anime, one of the Viking notices that he's got so much skill and so much technique that he's able to just almost semi-dodge each one of the blows. They still make contact, but not enough that any force can be transferred to him. And he's so good at doing it that none of the other Vikings even notice that he's doing that. And he ends up being able to take the 100 punches. And not only that, it's by the end the big Viking is so exhausted from trying to punch him with all of his strength and every punch, trying to get a one shot kill with every single punch will do that to you. Trust me, if you've never done martial arts or things like that, trust me, that is actually true, especially when you're wearing armor and things like that. So he does that, and he ends up gaining the respect of the Vikings. Even the one who was hitting him acknowledges him as a quote-unquote great warrior. And I'd put my hand to the fire that most people watched that scene and thought, oh my God, he stuck to his ideals, and because he was able to remain peaceful while in the force, while being confronted with overwhelming strength, that's why they let him through. I would argue that is the exact opposite of his philosophy. Well, not perhaps the exact opposite of his stated philosophy of peacefulness, but I think what most people don't realize, and what he himself doesn't even realize, is that the only reason why the Vikings let him through is because they respect him, and the only reason why they respect him is because he showed his skill, his might as a warrior, to be able to absorb all of those punches, which no untrained person, no one who hadn't previously acquired the strength and the might and the skill, the force, which he is so trying to fight against, no one who hadn't acquired that before would have been able to do. So really, the only reason why they let him through is because of his strength. Sorry, the girls started to run there. I thought I was about to have a big tug. Yeah, it's only because he's a strong warrior, and they even say so themselves, that they respect him as a great warrior, not because he was peaceful, but rather because he was able to show his might as a warrior by taking all those hits, which is something that, again, he would not have been able to do if he hadn't been an ultra overpowered warrior himself in the first place. So when you think about it, his entire philosophy of trying to build a peaceful world where there's no war and the strong don't oppress the weak and all that crumbled at the first challenge. Because in any other circumstance, if it was his friend, his brother from another mother, Einar, who had gone there and who had tried to do the exact same thing, or even anyone who was just a little bit less powerful, a little bit less skilled, a little bit less mighty than he is, they would not have succeeded. They would have gotten their skulls bashed in, and that would have been the end of that. So he does. So hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say here, and how that's contrary, or that makes his philosophy or his goal somewhat self-defeating in the real world. Don't get me wrong, in the ideal fantasy world, sure, go ahead, and his concept might work, but in the real world, well, or even in the case of this anime, he gained the ability to do what he did, and to eventually talk to Cnut and to convince the king to not invade the farm and to not kill more people and to just go away. He was only able to do that because he was the mightiest person in the room. So what do you think would happen? And now I'm going to transition a little bit out of talking about only Vinland Saga. But what would have happened if it was his son? He doesn't have a son in the show, I'm trying to illustrate. But if it was, one of his descendants who had tried to do the exact same thing, who had tried to not resist, well, he wouldn't have had the might to do, the ability to do what Thorfinn does, and therefore the mighty, the strong, the powerful who would have come to invade wouldn't have listened to him. And they would have just used force, because that's what they know, and they would have taken over, and his entire society, his entire dream would have collapsed instantly. At the first, and that's the point that I'm trying to drive towards, is that in the real world, unfortunately, until humans mature, until humans become a single group, as long as there's division, and as long as there is this current societal model that we're living under, might makes right. Because as soon as there's a peaceful society gets challenged by the stronger one, they can't resist. And it's entirely up to the stronger, the mightier, to decide what they want to do. And hey, if they want to kill, rape, and murder and plunder the entire society, well, they will do it. And there is absolutely nothing that the less strong society or group will be able to do to stop them. The only way to stop them is if a third party who's even stronger or mightier than the invaders comes in and imposes their will on the invaders. But that loops around to the exact principle that these peaceful folk are trying to fight against. They need someone who is mightier and who is stronger to come in and to save them, right? I hopefully you understand what I'm driving towards. And might isn't necessarily just physical strength, right? Might can be represented, as in the real world, by economic strength, right? Someone bullies you out of your apartment because they have $1 million. Well, then you need a $1 billion billionaire to come in and to outmight and outpurchase the millionaire, and to prevent, you know what I mean? It can work with words, it can work with economy. The point is that whoever is in a position of dominance, regardless of what kind of field you're discussing, but in most cases we talk about brute military might. That's what we mean, right? But it applies to the other ones too. Other examples like economics that I just mentioned. But whoever is mightier always in our current world gets to impose their will on the others. And to go back to Vinland Saga for a second there, his grand plan, the reason why it's called Vinland, for those of you who don't know, is in the old Norsemen, the Vikings, who did discover North America. They actually did establish a settlement in Nova Scotia here in Canada back in the, I think, around the year between 900 and 1000 ish. They called North America Vinland, the land of wine, because it was so fertile and vast and blah blah blah. But to play devil's advocate here, even if in season 3 they succeed and they go to this place that he keeps chasing and that he keeps mentioning all throughout season 2, that is out of reach of the mighty, out of reach of the warlords and the slave traders. Sorry, the girls keep getting tangled. I just need to fix the leash. Even if he succeeds in getting there and establishing a colony, we all know that at the time, even then, North America wasn't truly uninhabited. There were a whole lot of Native Americans there already, and a lot of them were peaceful, but a lot of those groups weren't. There were as many savage wars in the North Americas before the white man came, and back then even, there were as many wars and conflicts as there are, well, maybe not as many as there are in Europe, but you get my point. It's not truly virgin, unspoiled, untamed wilderness with no competition. And on top of that, that if he does make it there, and when he does meet these groups, because they will eventually run into each other, now they will be in a situation where, unlike what he did before leaving, well, talking to King Cnut, he won't be able to do that. They will not be able to communicate, at least to start with, right? Because they won't understand each other. So he's gonna be losing the one asset that he used, his tongue and his words, to convince the king to not pillage the village. He won't have that tool available to him when he first encounters the Native Americans. And a single misunderstanding could easily trigger this much larger people, who is much mightier than his little settlement would be, to wage war and to wipe them out, right? So he doesn't know that. He's trying to flee basically all of mankind, and his only solution, the only way that his peaceful way of living would actually be sustainable in the real world, or even in his world, is if there's no one else around, is if there's no other group there to fight him for it, to impose their might onto his group. Other few challenges with that is this also assumes that there will never be any conflict that arises within your group. Right? People might be fleeing war and persecution and oppression and go with him to Vinland. But what happens once they get there? Maybe the first generation or 2 or 3 will remember what it was like and will live according to his peaceful ideals. But whether it's within 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years, don't tell me that you really believe that it's at the current level of maturity of the human race, let alone back then when things were even more primitive and there was less education and less philosophy and less of all of these things. Do you really think it's reasonable to expect that in permanence, there will never ever be someone who will, even if accidentally, impose their might and their will onto other members of their own group, who will become, the internal faction that's going to vie for a little bit more power, a little bit more control, a little bit more land compared to their neighbor. And the society, like that, to me, it's almost self-evident that will eventually happen, whether it's willingly or by a pure mistake. But something will happen, and eventually a group will form, will emerge, and violence will, or might, if not violence, but the concept of the mighty imposing their will on the less mighty will fail. It has to. Right now, humans are very much animals, and it's unfortunately in our nature to be acting this exact way. I mean, look at what's going on, to connect it to the real world. Look at what's going on in Gaza right now. Look at what's going on in Ukraine, right? The only way that Israel would stop massacring all these poor Palestinians is if someone forces them to. And that someone has to have the might to back up their claims, right? I'm thinking specifically about the UN. UN resolutions are non-binding, so Israel can ignore them if they want. And on top of that, they know that they have the current mightiest power on the planet, the Americans, backing them, because it's in the interest of the Americans to back up the Israelis. I have discussed this in another episode previously. I won't rehash all of that. But the point is that they know that they have the might, so they can impose their will, and they know that no one's going to stop them, because at the ground level, at the first level, the Gazans can't compete with their might on the ground. And at the higher level, even the international community won't be able to do anything about them, even if they would have the might and the power to stop them, because they've got the Americans in their corner. Same thing with Russia. Why does Putin think that it's okay that he can just go and rewrite history and say that Ukraine was always Russian and we're just taking back what was always ours, right? And he can set his narrative and literally rewrite his history because he's stronger, and no one can stop him. He has the might. The Ukrainians don't, and they are bravely resisting, but they need all the help that the West can give, and the West is starting to falter in their support of them. So guess what? Again, people might say that the pen is mightier than the sword, but I don't think those people ever met a nuclear missile or the Russian war machine, right? So it's unfortunately, and I guess there's a few other ways I can go towards this, but I don't want to make this video too long. It's already half an hour long, so I'll say two other points quickly. To go back to Vinland Saga, it's all temporary. Even if he did make it to a place where there are no other humans to contest his group, and even if his group somehow remains peaceful and never resorts to infighting, to the rise of might, like I had just mentioned previously, and that applies also to us, right? Even if someone goes and makes a colony on the moon where there's no other humans right now, eventually, that's also temporary, because eventually, one day, someone will make it there. Think of the examples of Vinland Saga and the Americas. the Native Americans, they didn't, but they could have been living, let's say in this anime world, they did. They lived peacefully with no conflict, whatever, for thousands of years. That's fine. But what happened when the first European settler arrived after Christopher Columbus? All of that shatters. It's only temporary, this type of peaceful, peace and love beatnik agenda. It's only temporary because eventually someone else will make it there. And they will be able to impose their might on you if they want to, because they'll have the ability to do that, and you will have completely destroyed any ability that you have to resist, and that's the death of your society or of your ideal right there. Right? So I really wish that humans could mature enough where we wouldn't need this type of might makes right philosophy. But unfortunately, the real world and the ideal world are two very different things, and we have to live in the real world. So that's why I'm saddened by all of this, but I just don't see how anyone could be naive enough to not realize that. There were a few other things I wanted to mention on this topic, but it's been too long of a video already, and Daisy is, as you can see, not willing to budge. But see, I would have the might if I wanted to just force her to keep going, right? Because I am definitely stronger than she is. But the only way to get away from might makes right is if might chooses not to use its might, not to impose its will on the others, and I accept that Daisy wants to go home, and that's what I'm gonna do. So even if I had a few more things, and I'm probably gonna be discussing this topic another time, it's time to go home. Have a good evening, everyone.